gathering, floating, expanding, gathering, sinking, wiping, floating, expanding, shrinking, sinking, floating, expanding, shrinking, sinking, floating, expanding, shrinking, expanding, shrinking back, floating, shrinking, expanding, shrinking, floating, expanding, sinking, shrinking, expanding, sinking, floating, sinking, floating, shrinking, hook, circle in, out, expand, wiping, floating, expanding, shrinking, expanding, shrinking, sinking, floating, expanding, floating, expanding, shrinking, circling, expanding left, sinking, expanding right, floating, sinking, circling, expanding, shrinking, sinking, expanding, floating, rotating, circling up here, sinking, floating, right, expanding, gathering this way, expanding, floating, sinking, shrinking, expanding, floating, spiraling, sinking, white, expanding, step up, gather back, floating, sinking. Here, gather, expand, gather, floating, sinking, floating, expanding. Open, gather, expand, coming in, floating, sinking, floating, expanding, locking, piercing, bringing in, piercing, gathering, expanding, kick, step down, floating, expanding, sinking, sinking, floating, expanding, spiraling, sinking, floating, on the front of the belt, sinking, from here, floating, sinking, floating, sinking, floating, expanding, circling, sinking, floating, sinking, floating, shrinking, expanding, shrinking, floating, expanding, sinking, gathering, expanding, sinking.